بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله. Last time we covered two chapters. One was about the turban of the Prophet ﷺ, and the other one was about the loincloth, the lower garment of the Prophet ﷺ. We also had our discussion in that detailed discussion about length of the shalwar, pajama, trousers, whatever. Next chapter is the Prophet ﷺ's walking, and in terms of his movement and speed with walking. This is something that's been covered briefly already in previous chapters with regards to the Prophet ﷺ's description. I'm sure you'll recall Sayyidina Ali al-Murtada radiallahu ta'ala mentioned in the first chapter the long narration about the description of the Prophet ﷺ. In that he actually mentions that the Prophet ﷺ, when he walked, would walk with very firm footing and as if someone's walking downhill, right? And how very carefully they'll walk with firm footing. In spite of this, the Prophet ﷺ walked very briskly as well. The Sahaba mentioned that they would struggle to keep up at their normal pace when walking with the Prophet ﷺ. And so in this chapter there's three narrations. First one is narrated by Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala, who says that I never saw anyone whose face was more radiant than the Prophet ﷺ. And he says the way he describes it, and you often find the Sahaba when they talk about the beauty of the Prophet ﷺ, they are forced to rely on metaphors, because in reality, how would it be possible to bring that perfection into words, that beauty into words? And so in this hadith he says that it was as if the sun was the sun was in the radiant in the face of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? It was orbiting in the face of the Prophet ﷺ. كأن الشمس تجري في وجهه. It's as if the sun was moving in the face of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's how he describes how radiant and beautiful the Prophet ﷺ's complexion was. But also talks about the Prophet ﷺ's walking, and he says that I've never seen, so the first thing he says, I never saw anyone with a face more radiant than the Prophet ﷺ, and I never saw anyone who walked as briskly, as swiftly as the Prophet ﷺ. It was as if, he describes that it was as if the earth was being rolled up for the Prophet ﷺ as he was walking. So distances were being shrunk for the Prophet ﷺ as he was walking. Right? That we would have a destination, and within a few moments, it seemed to us that it was a few moments we would arrive at our destination. And Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala, he says that even though the Prophet ﷺ was walking at his usual pace, his companions would struggle to keep up with the Prophet ﷺ. one thing to remember, the Prophet ﷺ is the perfect creation. He's the best of all of Allah's creation, and He is the perfect being, the perfect creation. And the Prophet ﷺ is superior to any other creation and anyone else, and from amongst humans in particular, the Prophet ﷺ is the greatest of all in terms of his spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and those abilities that come as part of being prophet and messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also in terms of his physical strength and abilities. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam his strength was unmatched. And so I'm reminded of a particular incident during the digging of the trenches before the Battle of Ahzab, and the Battle of the Trenches. As you know, Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala, he gave this idea of digging trenches around the city to stop the attacking army from getting into the city. And while those trenches were being dug, the work was divided up between everybody. The Prophet ﷺ actually partook in the digging of those trenches as well. But at one particular point, the Sahaba, that group whose turn it was to dig, they encountered a huge boulder which they couldn't break. They tried collectively, all of them, to break it down, and they couldn't. And so they came to the Prophet ﷺ, and they asked the Prophet ﷺ to help. And the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't do dua on that occasion, or it wasn't a spiritual remedy. The Prophet ﷺ took up the pickaxe and went himself and struck the rock, and 3 times, for each time, first 2 times, small portion breaking off, and 3rd time, completely broken. So it's a long narration. There's other points within that narration as well. But just to demonstrate to you that even in terms of physical strength as well, the Prophet ﷺ was unmatched, unlike none other. Again, there's reference to Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala and his narration in there as well. The next 2 narrations are both narrated by Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala, and in which he mentions that the Prophet ﷺ would walk with his back slightly arched, or lowered gaze, lowered head, and would walk in a manner, as I mentioned before, as if he's walking downhill with firm footing. And he didn't drag his feet along the ground. Right? That's mentioned in those 2 verses. The next chapter is regarding the Prophet ﷺ. If you remember, in the chapter regarding the imamah, regarding the turban, I mentioned to you that the Prophet, in one narration it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ had a cloth underneath the turban. And this chapter is regarding that cloth that the Prophet ﷺ had separately on his head, upon which the Prophet ﷺ then wore his hat and turban. And the reason for this is mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, he had this there because the Prophet ﷺ used to use ample oil in his hair, and it was to prevent the imamah from becoming stained with the oil that was in the hair of the Prophet ﷺ. That he would have this cloth underneath, and then the turban he would tie on top of that. So there's one hadith in this chapter, and this is narrated by Sayyidina Anas bin Malik radiallahu ta'ala. And he says that often the Prophet ﷺ had a loose cloth over his head, and this cloth would become so oily that it would appear to be like the rag of someone who extracts oils. So someone who works in that environment, or who extracts oils. And so it doesn't, this is actually shows you the care that the Prophet ﷺ took with regards to his cleanliness and personal hygiene. Don't let your mind wander towards the other side, because yes, this cloth would soak up the oil that was in the Prophet ﷺ's hair, but it would prevent the imama from staining, from showing stains of oil. And do remember that in terms of actual cleanliness and hygiene, the Prophet ﷺ, again, perfection in every way. In the same as, even in terms of his hygiene and cleanliness as well. And I don't want to bring in too many narrations that are going to be part of the Shama'il from other chapters, because we'll look at them as and when we get to them. But even like in terms of, so there's a narration and there's many narrations regarding this, but Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, in particular, in one narration, she asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she said that, Ya Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I often go to the lavatory Baytul Khala after you, and I don't see anything except for a fragrance of musk. So even in those natural human or biological processes, you can see the beauty there, you can see the cleanliness and the purity there, to the extent that there's a narration when Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, when the accusation was made against her, which is known as the incident of ifk, which actually ifk means a huge slander, right? The worst possible type of lie. And this was when Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, her chastity and her being faithful to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was challenged by the munafiqeen. During that period, the Prophet ﷺ separately spoke to different Sahaba to gauge what they were thinking. On the occasion when he spoke to Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, he asked him, he said, what do you make of this situation? And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, he said, who chose Aisha as your wife for you? And the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah chose her. And so he said to the Prophet ﷺ that I have absolutely I have no doubt at all that she's impeccable in her character. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah does not allow, and these are his words that are recorded in one narration, that when Allah does not allow a fly to sit on your clothes or your person, because flies sit on dirt, on filth. And Allah does not allow a fly to sit on your person or your clothes, why would He choose for you a wife whose character is doubtful? And so, in terms of cleanliness and purity, you can see from that even flies and insects were not permitted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to land on the body, the person, the clothes of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The next chapter is about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's sitting and his manner of sitting. There's 3 ahadith in this chapter, and just to summarize before looking at those ahadith, there's 3 different methods that are mentioned that are considered to be practices of the Prophet ﷺ in relation to how to sit in a majlis and gathering. So when the Prophet ﷺ was sitting in his gatherings amongst the Sahaba, there's 3 different postures that are mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ would adopt. The first one is sitting legs folded the way you would during Salah, for males. Right? So that particular posture doesn't mean that the foot was upright, but simply legs folded, knees out in front of you, sitting in that posture. The other is legs crossed and folded. And the third one is sitting with both knees up in the air, with the arms around the knees. So those three particular postures are mentioned in terms of as a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ when sitting in normal majlis in gathering. And so the first narration mentions that it's a Sahabiya, a female companion by the name of Qayla. She says that she came to the Prophet ﷺ and she saw the Prophet ﷺ sitting on a Hessian mat. And in this narration it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ was sitting in that posture that I mentioned last, with knees up in the air, right, and arms around the knees. The Prophet ﷺ was sitting in that manner, and this is considered to be a posture of humility. And she saw that humility in the Prophet ﷺ, and she began to tremble. She was overcome with awe. She was awe-stricken and she began to tremble. And that's all it mentions. Imam Tirmidhi, rahimahullah ta'ala, only narrates that portion. This incident is narrated through other sources as well. And there's more detail there. In some narrations it mentions that a very similar incident, and it mentions a man rather than a woman. It's possible that this happened on two separate occasions, or that there was mix-up somewhere. In this particular narration, this Sahabiya, this companion, she narrates about herself. So she says, this happened to me. And when I saw the Prophet ﷺ sitting in this manner, I began to tremble. So from this we can see that this was referring, she obviously is not mistaken about herself having that experience. It also mentions in some narrations that perhaps she saw the Prophet ﷺ, because this again is one of those, the posture itself and the manner, the way that the Prophet ﷺ was sitting, perhaps was indicative of deep concern and thought. And that's quite, that's very much in keeping with the character of the Prophet ﷺ, in terms of his worry for the sake of the Ummah and for his followers. And perhaps it was that which she saw which overcame her in terms of emotionally, and she began to tremble. Well, whatever the reason is, in some narrations it mentions that someone was actually sitting there. She came up to the Prophet ﷺ, saw the Prophet ﷺ sitting in this manner, and the Prophet ﷺ hadn't looked up at her. And she began to tremble, and the Prophet ﷺ was told about this. She was standing behind the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ did not look at her. Someone said to the Prophet ﷺ, they said, Ya Rasulullah, this woman has begun to tremble. She's obviously, she's overcome with emotions of awe. And so the Prophet ﷺ then commanded her and said to her, be at peace. Without turning, without looking at her, he simply said, be at peace. And she says that at that point, all my concerns and whatever I was experiencing, they subsided immediately, and I was completely calm and collected. That's all it took was for the Prophet ﷺ to say to her, be at peace. So that hadith clearly talks about, and it mentions this manner of sitting of the Prophet ﷺ. And in another narration, it mentions the Prophet ﷺ, the second narration mentions the Prophet ﷺ laying down in the masjid with one foot placed over the other. Now, this seems to, there's a prohibition of lying in this way in a hadith as well. There's a hadith in Sahih Muslim which prohibits lying in this manner, where you have one foot placed over the other leg. And there's a couple of things here. Number one, this mentions sitting. This chapter is for how the Prophet ﷺ used to sit, not lie down. So why is this hadith here? Number two, if this is prohibited, then surely the Prophet ﷺ does not do that which he prohibits. So how do you reconcile? How do you explain? And so there's two different ways that this can be understood. One is that the prohibition is for laying down with one knee up in the air and the other foot resting on that knee. Somebody laying flat on their back with one knee up in the air and the other foot resting on that knee. That's the prohibition. And the reason that those ulama who've gone down that view, the reason that they've given is that this is because in those times and amongst the Arabs, the traditional dress was not stitched clothing. There's a loincloth. And so there's more possibility, more likelihood of the aura, those parts of the body which need to be concealed, of that becoming exposed in that manner. And so that's why it's prohibited. And however, this manner of sitting where your legs are out straight in front of you, both of them, and then you have one foot on top of the other, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not prohibited, and that's why this is mentioned in this chapter. And the other question still remains as to why Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala has mentioned this hadith in this chapter, which is about sitting, and not in the chapter, because there's a separate chapter that he's mentioned about the Prophet ﷺ sleeping and lying down. Simply, some of the ulama have simply, the simple answer that they've given is that here it just means the Prophet ﷺ's manner of sitting and reclining. It's open to both. Right? The Prophet ﷺ's manner of resting, of sitting, of reclining, and that's inclusive of both. And the third hadith in this chapter is narrated by Sayyidina Abu Sa'id Khudri radiallahu ta'ala, who says that, again mentioning this manner of sitting of the Prophet ﷺ, where both knees were up in the air and arms around the knees. And this is, so from here we can actually see that this is something that perhaps the Prophet ﷺ would sit frequently in this manner. Remember, the Prophet ﷺ didn't sit on a throne or a chair. The Prophet ﷺ sat on the floor. And the most you will find in narrations is a leather mat or a hessian mat. And sitting on the floor, naturally people tend to change their posture, the way they're sitting after some time. And so this is something that it seems that the Prophet ﷺ would frequently sit in this manner. And there's narrations which mention as well that this manner of sitting, this manner of reclining is the wall of the Arabs. What does that mean? If you have a wall, you sit back, you can sit however you want, and you can rest your back against the wall. In that sort of climate, not always an option. If you don't have anything to lean on, if you don't have anything to rest your back against, then sitting in that manner can give you the comfort that you get from resting your back against something. And it was even customary, sometimes, usually they'd sit in this manner when they were tired, when they felt physically, they'd exerted themselves or been sitting for a long time. And what some people would do is they'd use a cloth to actually tie around their waist and around their shins, around the knees, and tie it into a knot. And so instead of having to hold their knees, their legs with their hands, they tie a cloth around it. And again, this was commonly practiced custom. However, I've mentioned to you the three methods that are considered to be customary. So now I can reference to you other ahadith as well, but Imam Tirmidhi hasn't, and so I'm going to leave it at that and move on. In terms of, so the three being: one, sitting with legs folded, knees out in front of you; one, legs crossed; and third one, knees up in the air, arms around the legs. And that's the one that's mainly mentioned in this particular chapter. A very prominent example of, for example, sitting with your legs folded, knees out in front of you, Hadith Jibreel, which you should be familiar with. The whole introduction of that is what Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu says. This person came in, his clothes were perfectly, brilliantly white, his hair was brilliantly black, and there were no signs of traveling on him, but none of us recognized him. He came in front of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He sat down, his knees began to touch the knees of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he placed his hands on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's thighs. So there you can see, he paints the whole picture for you there of how both of them sat, knees out, legs folded, knees out in front of them, and knees touching. And obviously the hadith later mentions the Prophet ﷺ told him that this was Jibreel alayhi salam. He came, he put his hands on the Prophet ﷺ's thighs, and he asked those questions: what is Islam, what is Iman, what is Ihsan, and so on. So that's this chapter about the Prophet ﷺ sitting, and the manner in which the Prophet ﷺ would sit. The next chapter is about the Prophet ﷺ reclining. And there's two chapters which are similar. One is, this chapter is about the Prophet ﷺ reclining on a cushion or a pillow or something of that nature. And then the next chapter is about the Prophet ﷺ reclining and leaning on something else, something other than pillow or cushion. In this chapter, there's 4 ahadith which are narrated by Imam Tirmidhi. The first one is Sayyidina Jabir bin Samra radiallahu ta'ala. He says that I saw the Prophet ﷺ sitting. He was reclining with a pillow or a cushion on his left-hand side. And so that perhaps the reason why that's been mentioned there by the author specifically to begin with is to show, because remember, often you have, especially in things which are meant for comfort, which are meant for beautification purposes, and anything in terms of hygiene and so on, usually you will find that the right hand side has priority. And so in this narration it mentions that the cushion was on the Prophet ﷺ's left hand side. And so perhaps the reason there is to show that there's no priority in this case, that it doesn't matter whether someone is reclining with, and is leaning on a cushion which is on their right hand side or on the left hand side, it doesn't make a difference. The next hadith is narrated by Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala, and he says that the Prophet ﷺ said to the Sahaba, he said, "Shall I tell you the biggest of all sins?" And the Sahaba, they said, "Indeed, Ya Rasulullah, do tell us." And the Prophet ﷺ said that the greatest of all sins is to associate a partner with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and disobedience of parents, and giving false testimony, lying under oath or giving false testimony, and lying in general. And so he says, the narrator says that the Prophet ﷺ was leaning on something at the time. When he said this, the Prophet ﷺ, when he talked about lying, so the Prophet ﷺ was leaning, when he spoke about lying, he sort of sat up, stopped leaning, and was no longer reclining, he was sitting up. And repeatedly the Prophet ﷺ kept on saying, "Beware of lying, beware of false testimony. This is one of the greatest of all sins." And he kept repeating himself until the narrator says that until we started to think in our minds, if only the Prophet ﷺ would be quiet. And there's one, the alarm bells start ringing there immediately. There's one question which has to be answered immediately, is that it seems, if you don't know the context, if you don't know if you don't consider looking around the narration, the question arises, is that not disrespectful for him to say that we started to wish that the Prophet ﷺ would be quiet, would stop speaking? So what's the reason? And many of the ulama have mentioned here that the reason wasn't out of any kind of disrespect. The reason was out of concern for the Prophet ﷺ. Because the Prophet ﷺ was so concerned about this and people becoming involved in this, that he sat up. And they could see that the Prophet ﷺ, from previously being in a position of comfort and reclining and resting, the Prophet ﷺ had sat up and he'd become restless and uneasy and was becoming more and more worried and agitated as he was saying this, out of fear of people, his ummah falling into these habits or this habit. In particular, the lying that was being repeated again and again. And so what actually the wish was, that they were wishing that the Prophet ﷺ would go back to the position of being at ease that he was in before. It was out of concern for the Prophet ﷺ that they were thinking this, not out of disrespect. And that's very, very clear that the Prophet ﷺ would often worry about his ummah falling into difficulty because of various sins and so on. It's no hidden fact that the Prophet ﷺ stood all night long praying for his ummah until his feet became swollen. The third hadith is Sayyidina Abu Juhayfa radiallahu anhu, he says, the Prophet ﷺ said to the Sahaba, he said, "I don't eat while I am reclining." Now, in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ didn't directly forbid them from doing this. He didn't say, "Don't eat while you're reclining." He said, "I don't do this." And that is actually, some ulama consider that to be even more emphatic, because you're not only being told to do something, but you're told to do something that the Prophet ﷺ is associating directly with himself. So two different statements. Don't do this. The other one, I don't do this. And with one statement, yes, it's a direct command. With the other one, it's an indirect command with the added emphasis showing that the Prophet ﷺ himself is doing that and prefers that as well. So and this reclining, the ulama have taken different views on this, that this means anything, any possible manner of reclining. Right? That you don't adopt any manner of reclining while you're eating, whether that's resting your back or leaning on your side, even on leaning on your hands on one side, whatever the manner, you eat while you're sitting upright. And there's obviously medical benefits for that as well. It's not good to eat reclining or laying down in any possible manner. And the last hadith in this chapter, Sayyidina Jabir bin Samurah radiallahu anhu, he says that I saw the Prophet ﷺ reclining on a cushion, on a pillow. And this has been mentioned previously as well. It's repeated here because it has an affinity with this chapter. And we'll stop there. The next, inshallah, discussion will take up in the next session. Any questions regarding that particular session before we move on?
When you're talking about Prophet oiling his hair, are there any specific narrations regarding specific reasons why he did that and specific benefits for the scalp of oiling the hair?
There will be. There are perhaps not something that I can narrate to you from memory. So I can look up, inshallah. Not something that I've got committed to memory, other than the fact that it is a well-established, well-known sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the reality being that everything that the Prophet ﷺ did and practiced is pure fitrah and nature and actually beneficial. In terms of verbal narrations, I'll have to look into that. In terms of your fiqh, we're looking through the sunnahs of wudu, and we got up to number 10 last time, continuity, doing your wudu continuously. That means washing the next limb before the first one is dry. Number 11, wiping the entire head once is also an emphatic sunnah. And so the method that's mentioned in order to, remember, it's not necessary to take fresh water to wash your hands before you wipe your head. So there's a specific method which is mentioned by which you can utilize the water that's already on your hand, do masa of the entire head and the ears and the neck, back of the neck, without having to wash your hands again. So using the water that's already on the hands, which is basically to use the insides of your 3 small fingers on both hands to do masa of the head, the center, the middle part of the head, taking it all the way to the back. Then using your palms of your hands to do masa of the side of the head. That way you've covered the whole head. Using your index finger inside the ear and the thumb behind, and then using the back of your hands to do the neck. That way you've actually used the moisture that's already on your hands. You don't need to wash your hands again. So that's not necessary. So wiping both ears is also an emphatic sunnah. That's also been mentioned, how you do that. And maintaining the sequence which is mentioned in the Quran is also an emphatic sunnah. Remember that verse, it's in the books as well. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions when you stand for إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ, and the whole verse, right? So what does it mention first? Wash your face, your arms, do massage the head, and wash your feet. That's the sequence that you need to maintain, which is sunnah. It's an emphatic sunnah. Beginning with the right hand side, this is a non-emphatic sunnah, and this is to commence with the right side when washing the hands and the feet, and brushing over your limbs, rubbing them while washing. It is sunnah, it's a non-emphatic sunnah, and the purpose is to ensure that your limbs are washed thoroughly. Abstaining from, it says extravagance when pouring water. This is an emphatic sunnah. And abstaining from aggressively splashing water on the face during wudu also, this is a non-emphatic sunnah. The purpose is for you to wash yourself, not others who are sat around you, if it's a communal place, or to wash the places that are around you. And also because of the sanctity of the face as well. Right? Generally speaking, the face is considered to be, respectful, something that commands respect, which is why it's forbidden to strike anyone across the face, and it's contrary to the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. Sometimes you will find in quite a lot of cases that people talk about places of contradiction between the law of the land and the Shari rulings. In reality, it's actually that's perhaps less than those places where it's actually a direct mirror of the Sharia and the advice of the Prophet ﷺ as well. So even with, for example, certain limited amount of physical chastisement is permitted for parents with their children, but even according to the law of the land, striking across the face and leaving a mark anywhere is illegal, isn't it? So that's something that's directly in accordance with the Sunnah and teachings of the Prophet ﷺ as well. So those are Sunnahs. Then you have mustahabbat, or recommendations, desirable actions of wudu, things that are desirable, that are recommended. So facing the direction of the qibla, because one of the reasons that's mentioned there is the position of acceptance of supplications, and during wudu, they're already in the book if you've got the book, but I did bring you print out as well of those du'as to learn them. They're coming up actually, and if you look at just the meanings of those du'as, there's nothing left that you'd want to ask for. And if this becomes a habit for somebody and they're doing those du'as 2, 3, 4, 5 times every single day, can be hoped for that at least at some point in their lives those du'as will be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or will coincide with the time of acceptance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To sit in a high position, that's to protect yourself from splashes from the water hitting the ground and splashing back onto you. Obviously, if that's not an issue, then that's not necessary as well. Making wudu in a place which is pure, again, there's practical reasons as well as spiritual, but the practical reasons are pretty obvious, because the water is likely to, in some capacity or other, to splash back onto your clothing or whatever, and to prevent that from happening in a place which is impure. And if the water is landing in impurity, then if it does splash back onto the person, then that water is effectively become impure. To refrain from common talk, as that will divert someone away from the du'as, the narrated supplications, that's really quite obvious. If you start talking, then the natural sort of inclination will be to carry on doing your wudu while you're talking, which means that you're not reading the du'as that you would benefit from reading. So unless it's something of a religious nature, something, perhaps some kind of religious teaching or ruling that's being discussed or so on, worldly and common talk should be avoided. It's recommended. To wipe the neck once, right? That's mustahab, it's recommended. That's why it wasn't mentioned previously in the sunnah. And that's done with the upper part of the hand, the back of the hand. To expand the washing of the face, the hands and the feet. Expand means basically wash a little beyond the required limit. Right? So if the required limit is up to and including the elbows, to wash a little beyond that. Doesn't mean all the way up to the shoulders. That there's no reason for that, and that would be wasteful, or washing all the legs up to the knees. No, just a little beyond the requirements, so that it can be absolutely certain that you have fulfilled the requirement. It's just a matter of caution, and it's a recommendation. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ would take, the Prophet ﷺ would mention this, and he would be pleased, and he would say that on the Day of Judgment, I will be the leader of. Now, the term in Arabic is "Ana qa'idul ghurr al-muhajjalin." This ghurr al-muhajjalin is a particular breed of horses. Right? There are black-colored horses with white marks on their hooves and their forehead. And so, it doesn't mean that the Prophet ﷺ will be leading those horses on the Day of Judgment. This is a metaphor which explained by the Prophet ﷺ himself, that my ummah will come on the Day of Judgment and they will be distinct amongst everybody else. They will be recognizable because their limbs that they have been washing during wudu will be shining brightly. What's that? The face, the arms and the feet. So just like those horses where the four hooves and the forehead have white marks on them, and the rest of the horse is black. And in that hadith that's mentioned in your book there as well, it mentions that there's encouragement from the Prophet ﷺ to exceed in that, in trying to achieve that whiteness on the Day of Judgment. To say tasmiyah, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, before washing or wiping each part, each limb of the body. So every time you move on to the next washing the next limb or wiping, you say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And to recite the narrated supplications, and these are the narrations that are mentioned here. These are not the only ones, there are other du'as that are mentioned as well. But if you look at these, it's actually a rather beautiful collection, because it covers everything right from each step of the wudu, from the beginning up till the end. So when rinsing the mouth, to say Allahumma a'inni ala tilawati al-Quran wa dhikrika wa shukrika wa husni ibadati. So Allah, help me in reciting the Quran and remembering you and paying gratitude to you and sincerity in worshipping you. Right? So that's because a lot of that, everything that's mentioned there, remember, tilawah of the Quran, dhikr of Allah, shukr, also gratitude. These are all done with what? With the tongue. And so when rinsing your mouth, you make that dua. When rinsing the nose, say, Allahumma arihni ra'ihat al-jannah wa la turihni ra'ihat al-nar. Oh Allah, allow me to smell the fragrance of Jannah and keep me away. Do not allow me to smell the fragrance of, the stench of the hellfire. So again, to do with the nose. Washing the face. Allahumma bayyid wajhi yawma tabyaddu wujuh wa taswaddu wujuh. Oh Allah, make my face bright on the day when some faces will be bright and others will be dark. Washing the right arm. Oh Allah, give me, Allahumma a'tini kitabi biyamini wa hasibni hisabi yasira. Oh Allah, give me my book in my right hand and make my accountability easy. This is a dua that was taught by the Prophet ﷺ to Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha as well. He said to her, Aisha, you should make this dua frequently. Allahumma hasibni hisaban yasira. Allah, make my accountability easy. Because no one will get through without the fadl and bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one will succeed. So that's something should be recited frequently anyway. Allahumma la tu'tini kitabi bishimali wa la min wara'i zahri. Allah, don't give my book in my left hand nor behind my back on the day of judgment. This is, I'm sure you know, the manner in which the books will be given. Those who have succeeded will be given their books in their right hand in front of them. Those who have failed will be given their book in their left hand behind their back. And so when washing the left hand, you ask Allah not to include you amongst those people. When wiping the head, Allahumma azillani tahta arshika yawma la zilla illa zillu arshik. Oh Allah, give me shade of your throne on the day when there will be no other shade but the shade of your throne. Right? And there's a very famous hadith which mentions those things. The Prophet said that there are a number of people, 7, I believe, number of people that other than them, no one will have any shade on the day of judgment, and they will be under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a number of things that I mentioned there. رَجُلٌ قَلْبُهُ مُعَلَّقٌ بِالْمَسْجِدِ, the person whose heart is attached to the masjid. You know, when one prayer is finished, he's gone out to do his business, but his heart's still there in the masjid. He wants to get back for the next salah. Or a just ruler, or someone who's had piety during their young age, and others as well. And when wiping the ears, Allahumma aj'alni min alladhina yastami'una al-qawla fayattabi'una ahsana. Oh Allah, make me from amongst those who listen to declaration and they act upon that which is good. Which is listening with the ears. Wiping the neck, Allahumma a'tiq raqabati min al-nar. Oh Allah, free my neck from the hellfire. In other words, don't allow me to enter the hellfire. When washing the right foot, Allahumma thabbit qadami ala sirati yawma tazillu al-aqdam. So, Allah, give me firm footing on the bridge, sirat, above the hellfire, on the day when people's footing will become loose and people will slip. And when washing the left foot, Allahumma ja'al dhanbi maghfuran wa sa'yi mashkuran wa tijarati lan tabur. Oh Allah, forgive my sins, so make my sins forgiven, my efforts accomplished and completed, and my trade free from any loss. And then finally, to finish with the declarations of faith, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh, and to finish with this supplication, Allahumma aj'alni min at-tawwabina waj'alni min al-mutatahhirin. O Allah, make me from amongst the repentant and make me from amongst those who are thoroughly pure. And why? Because Allah says in the Quran, Allah loves those who repent and He loves those who are thoroughly clean. And so you're asking Allah to make you effectively amongst those people that Allah loves. So number 9, to drink the water thereafter, which is leftover water, while facing the Qibla in a standing position, in the same manner that you would do, for example. To avoid shaking the hands in order to sort of remove any excess water. to dry the body parts with a handkerchief or a towel or any other manner, to offer 2 units of rak'ah nafil prayer after completing the wudu, as long as you're not in the makruh time. It's not time that is prohibited from praying. And so the Prophet said, whoever makes wudu the way I have done wudu and offers 2 units of prayer, in which he doesn't become distracted by anything, he will have his past sins forgiven. The narration about Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu ta'ala as well, and the Prophet hearing his footsteps in Jannah in front of him on the night of Mi'raj, and coming back and asking him, what exactly do you do? And there was this thing that was mentioned, that I do wudu, and every time I do wudu I pray 2 units of nafil if the time permits. Things that are not recommended or disliked during wudu. Right? Number 1, leaving any emphatic sunnah like rinsing the mouth, right? And this is reprehensible. Leaving a non-emphatic sunnah, so like beginning from the right side, this is considered to be undesirable. Leaving any of the mustahabbat, the desirable actions like wiping the neck, this is against the preferred practice and will diminish the reward of whatever action you're doing. And so you can stop there. If you do have the books, then do try to memorize those du'as. I would recommend that you do actually buy the book if we're going through it, or at least if anyone does have it, then get it off them and photocopy those du'as and learn. You can have a read through the next section of things that nullify and break wudu as well, which we'll cover next time. Any questions?
What intention would you make if you were to read the 2 rakat nafil after wudu?
To read?
The 2 rakat
Just nafil does not require any specific intention. So just 2 units of nafil of optional prayer. If you want to specifically, then tahiyatul wudu. But nafil doesn't require a specific intention. That's for fard prayer or obligatory prayers. I had this there because the Prophet ﷺ used to use ample oil in his hair, and it was to prevent the imama from becoming sort of stained with the oil that was in the hair of the Prophet ﷺ. That he would have this cloth underneath, and then the turban he would tie on top of that. So there's one hadith in this chapter, and this is narrated by Sayyidina Anas bin Malik radiallahu ta'ala. And he says that often the Prophet ﷺ had a loose cloth over his head, and this cloth would become so oily that it would appear to be like the rag of someone who extracts oils. So someone who works in that sort of environment, or who extracts oils. And so it doesn't, this is actually shows you the care that the Prophet ﷺ took with regards to his cleanliness and personal hygiene. Don't let your mind wander towards the other side, because yes, this cloth would soak up the oil that was in the Prophet ﷺ's hair, but it would prevent the imama from staining, from showing stains of oil. And do remember that in terms of actual cleanliness and hygiene, the Prophet ﷺ, again, perfection in every way. In the same as, even in terms of his hygiene and cleanliness as well. And I don't want to bring in too many narrations that are going to be part of the Shama'il from other chapters, because we'll look at them as and when we get to them. But even like in terms of, so there's a narration and there's many narrations regarding this, but Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, in particular, in one narration, she asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she said that, Ya Rasulullah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله. Last time we covered two chapters. One was about the turban of the Prophet ﷺ, and the other one was about the loincloth, the lower garment of the Prophet ﷺ. We also had our discussion in that detailed discussion about length of the shalwar, pajama, trousers, whatever. Next chapter is the Prophet ﷺ's walking, and in terms of his movement and speed with walking. This is something that's been covered briefly already in previous chapters with regards to the Prophet ﷺ's description. I'm sure you'll recall Sayyidina Ali al-Murtada radiallahu ta'ala mentioned in the first chapter the long narration about the description of the Prophet ﷺ. In that he actually mentions that the Prophet ﷺ, when he walked, would walk with very firm footing and as if someone's walking downhill, and how very carefully walk with firm footing. In spite of this, the Prophet ﷺ walked very briskly as well. The Sahaba mentioned that they would struggle to keep up at their normal pace when walking with the Prophet ﷺ. And so in this chapter there's three narrations. First one is narrated by Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala, who says that I never saw anyone whose face was more radiant than the Prophet ﷺ. And he says the way he describes it, and you often find the Sahaba, when they talk about the beauty of the Prophet ﷺ, they are forced to rely on metaphors, because in reality, how would it be possible to bring that perfection into words, that beauty into words? And so in this hadith he says that it was as if the sun was the sun was in the radiant in the face of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was orbiting in the face of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. كأن الشمس تجري في وجهه. It's as if the sun was moving in the face of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's how he describes how radiant and beautiful the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's complexion was. But also talks about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's walking, and he says that I've never seen, so the first thing he says, I never saw anyone with a face more radiant than the Prophet ﷺ, and I never saw anyone who walked as briskly, as swiftly as the Prophet ﷺ. It was as if, he describes that it was as if the earth was being rolled up for the Prophet ﷺ as he was walking. So distances were being shrunk for the Prophet ﷺ as he was walking. Right? That we would have a destination, and within a few moments, it seemed to us that it was a few moments we would arrive at our destination. And Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala, he says that even though the Prophet ﷺ was walking at his usual pace, his companions would struggle to keep up with the Prophet ﷺ. One thing to remember, the Prophet ﷺ is the perfect creation. He's the best of all of Allah's creation, and he is the perfect being, the perfect creation. And the Prophet ﷺ is superior to any other creation and anyone else, and from amongst humans in particular, the Prophet ﷺ is the greatest of all in terms of his spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those abilities that come as part of being prophet and messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also in terms of his physical strength and abilities. The Prophet ﷺ his strength was unmatched. And so I'm reminded of a particular incident during the digging of the trenches before the Battle of Ahzab, the Battle of the Trenches. As you know, Sayyidina Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala, he gave this idea of digging trenches around the city to stop the attacking army from getting into the city. And while those trenches were being dug, the work was divided up between everybody. The Prophet ﷺ actually partook in the digging of those trenches as well. But at one particular point, the Sahaba, that group whose turn it was to dig, they encountered a huge boulder which they couldn't break. They tried collectively, all of them, to break it down, and they couldn't. And so they came to the Prophet ﷺ, and they asked the Prophet ﷺ to help. And the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't do dua on that occasion, or it wasn't a spiritual remedy. The Prophet ﷺ took up the pickaxe and went himself and struck the rock, and 3 times, for each time, first 2 times, small portion breaking off, and 3rd time, completely broken. So it's a long narration. There's other points within that narration as well. But just to demonstrate to you that even in terms of physical strength as well, the Prophet ﷺ was unmatched, unlike none other. Again, there's reference to Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala and his narration in there as well. The next 2 narrations are both narrated by Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala, and in which he mentions that the Prophet ﷺ would walk with his back slightly arched, or lowered gaze, lowered head, and would walk in a manner, as I mentioned before, as if he's walking downhill with firm footing. And he didn't drag his feet along the ground. Right? That's mentioned in those 2 verses. The next chapter is regarding the Prophet ﷺ. If you remember, in the chapter regarding the imamah, regarding the turban, I mentioned to you that the Prophet, in one narration it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ had a cloth underneath the turban. And this chapter is regarding that cloth that the Prophet ﷺ had separately on his head, upon which the Prophet ﷺ then wore his hat and turban. And the reason for this is mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, he